family here, so we just kind of had more of a Western meal. It was a little disorganized, but it was cool. Regardless, enough of the true self talk. We're moving on through Philippians, and we're actually getting close toward the end of this book. We've been going through talking about joy in different circumstances. And today we're going to be moving on to a section that actually isn't commonly understood as I'm going to share it. But regardless, follow with me. We're going to start from Philippians 4, verses 8 to 9. And I'm just going to read this, so listen as I read. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Whatever you have learned or received or heard from me or seen in me, put into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. Now, I titled this sermon "Engage," because I'm going to be talking about how we as believers are meant to engage with culture. And this isn't commonly how this is talked about, but I'm going to talk about how we engage with culture. And for whatever reason, I grew up, not really as a Trekkie, but I grew up watching the show Star Trek: The Next Generation. For those of you, you guys will look at, Patrick Stewart, you think of Professor Xavier. I think of Jean-Luc Picard. And this word stuck with me because he would always say it on this show. So this is going to be 30 seconds of nonsense. It's going to completely derail this message, but regardless, we're going to go with this. So just watch this very briefly.
Engage. Engage.
Director Steve is forced.
Engage. 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 Engage.
So yes, that was very random, and that probably confused many of you. And if I do engage, it's probably going to cause a lot of confusion. Regardless, what we want to talk about today is how we engage with culture. And to back it up, let me explain a little bit myself. I'm a Korean American, and so for myself, I was kind of born into two cultures. And in many ways, there's always this kind of identity crisis that comes when you're raised in multiple cultures. I know we got some MKs in the room. This is something they deal with their entire lives. Who am I? And myself, as a Korean American, that was a struggle I had too. I had to make a choice. Was I going to be more Korean? Or was I going to be more American? Now, you can actually flip to the next slide. There's a next one, please. Next, there you go. There's a word. There's a sociological term called selective acculturation. Now to back it up, okay, Deacon Don's laughing over there. To back it up, the common belief was that when you had an immigrant, and the thought was that immigrant would assimilate, would become like the dominant culture wherever they live. So if a Korean was to go to America and was to be born and raised there, the understanding was that they would be completely American. However, what we found is that isn't necessarily true. And instead you see that the immigrant culture is very different in that those like myself that are raised in two different cultures, we actually tend to pick and choose different elements of both cultures and in many sense create our own culture. Right? That's selective acculturation. You're picking and choosing from different cultures and kind of forming your own identity from them. Right? So unlike the common understanding that I would assimilate and become completely American, that wasn't necessarily the case. Now a very interesting phenomenon is if you take any Korean American and you turn on the Olympics, and you have all these nations that are competing against each other, for whatever strange reason, no matter where this person is from, if they have a Korean background, they'll start to cheer for the Korean. Even if they can't pronounce the name of the Korean. Right? That's kind of how I grew up. We would be watching something and be like, oh, that's Korean, kind of looks like me. And all of a sudden I'm cheering for them, sometimes more so over my American counterparts. And it's very interesting. It's an interesting phenomenon that if you take an immigrant, specifically a Korean immigrant, they will automatically cheer for their own race in the Olympics. It's a weird thing. Regardless, selective acculturation is something that we see in the immigrant culture of people that come and have two different cultures. They pick and choose, and in many ways create their own. Now Paul, the author of this text, in many ways, is very similar to me. He had two cultures. He was both Greek and Jewish. And in that sense, he was picking and choosing from both. And in many ways, could speak into both cultures. And so in that same way, Paul had kind of formed his own culture that could speak into both. And that he was an effective witness to both. So, why am I talking about all this? If we were to go back to the passage, the passage itself, when people look at it, it seems like a very straightforward passage. Most people would look at it, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable. They would look at that, and those are words that make sense to us in the English language. And the most common understanding of this text is when the thought is, I'm going to only focus on these things that are good, these things that are right, these things that are pure. And there's some good things behind that, but that's not necessarily what the text is speaking of. Because if you look back at verse 7, that's where it's talking about how the peace of God is guarding our thoughts. Right? Another interpretation of this text is, I need to think positively. I need to think about things that are pure. I need to think about things that are good, and these things will happen to me. It's another understanding of the text. But what I'm going to talk about, it's going to be slightly more technical. But it's really how this text has spoken to me over the years. Now, there are two things I'm going to focus on, and that's themes that have been going on throughout this book of Philippians. And the first is that Paul is constantly reminding the Philippians what their actual identity is. He keeps saying, you're a citizen of heaven. You're a citizen of heaven. Live in a manner worthy of the gospel because you're a citizen in heaven. Right? He's reminding them what their actual identity was. This was a group of people that took pride in being citizens of Rome. But what he's actually telling them is, you're a citizen of heaven. The other thing he's also been telling them again and again is, be like me. Follow my example. And we're going to touch on these two things in a second. Now, when you get into this text, when you actually look at the original language of these verses, what stands out is the words that are used only appear in this one verse in the entire Bible. These are words that never show up again. Now, for us in English, they look like common, understandable words. But for someone who's reading the Bible in its original language, they would stick out because these are not words that are commonly used among Christians. And it would just stick out to them and be like, whoa, what is Paul really trying to say here? The reason why is because these words come from Hellenistic philosophy, or also from Jewish wisdom culture. And so these are both different elements that aren't necessarily understood to be part of the church. If anything, they're cultural terms. Right? So when it says whatever is right, whatever is whatever is noble, whatever is pure, right? What it's actually saying is terms that meant something specifically to people of that culture. Now, for our own circumstance, let's say we're in Korea, it would be something that would be more understandable to a Korean. It would be like whatever is jang, whatever is 최고. It would be words that would speak into the Korean element. If we were in the 70s in America, it would be like, whatever is hip, whatever is groovy. It would be cultural words for that specific time. That's what Paul is using in this circumstance. And the reason why is because he's reminding them, yes, you are a citizen of heaven, but don't forget where you are. Don't forget your present circumstance. Don't forget the culture that you're in right now. The verb think actually can be understood better as to take into account. And so what he's saying is, you look at all these things that are going on, all these things within your culture, take into account. Consider these different things. What that points to is what's up here right now, common grace. When we look at culture, when we look at the things that happen, if we understand that God gives all good things, that even things that aren't meant to worship Him, even things that aren't really made for Him, still have elements, traces of God in them. Right? When we're talking about great music, when we're talking about a great movie, a great drama, all these different things, God still speaks to us through those things, even if they weren't intended for that purpose. There's a common grace that transcends all of culture. Now, a couple things to note here is that, again, Paul says, follow my example. If you think about the example of Paul, he would always witness to both Jews and Greeks. He would first go to Jews in the synagogue, he would speak to them through their culture, and he would try to reach out and share the gospel with the Jews. He would also go to the Greeks and argue with them, philosophize with them. If you go to Acts 17, there's that famous passage where Paul goes to Athens and he gets in a debate with different philosophers. And he starts talking about this monument to the unknown God. And in that argument, or in that debate, he actually quotes two Greek philosophers. So it's very understandable that Paul knows what he's talking about. Paul knows Greek culture just as well as these other people. So that's how he's able to speak into their lives, because he understands their culture. And he's able to use things that weren't meant for God to point them back to God. That's the example that Paul gives us. So, let's go to the next slide. When we talk about how the church interacts with culture, these are the three most common interactions the church has with culture: combat, cocoon, conform. This is actually from a book I had in seminary by Dick Staub, Church and Culture. I have some seminarians here who know what I'm talking about. Regardless, these are the common responses the church has with culture. The first is it combats culture. It says this is bad. Don't do this. Don't be a part of this. The second is in my cocoon, meaning it says stay away from culture. And in many senses, creates its own subculture. Don't listen to secular music. Here's some Christian music. Listen to this instead. And essentially separates itself from society. And the last is it conforms. It just says, okay, everything's permissible. Just let's do, let's just consume culture however you wish. Okay? These are the three most common responses the church has with culture. Now, to take an aside, from my own context, the situation I grew up in was really during a period in the time when the church was very much in the cocoon phase. And during that period, when I was a young believer, what was a very kind of an accepted thing is when you started to get quote unquote more faithful, you would get rid of all of your secular stuff. No more secular music, no more secular movies. People would say, oh, I gave it up, and everyone would clap, and it was kind of a movement, and it bothered me, honestly, because I was like, wait a minute, is this right? Is that really what we're called to be as believers, is to just completely just detach ourselves from the world? And what bothered me even more is I like music. I've always liked music. I'm a bit of a music snob, if you will. And I remember there's a very popular praise song at the time. I'm dating myself when I say this, but I give thanks. I give thanks to you, Lord. It starts off with kind of this catchy guitar riff, right? And I was like, okay, that's kind of a cool song. But then my sisters were listening to indie music back then, and they were listening to the Indigo Girls. And it's the same exact riff, and I was like, oh my goodness. They copied them. And I was like, that's horrible. And yeah, it was, I remember that period, I was very confused. Because on one hand, people were telling me to be a good Christian, you had to give all this up. But then when I looked at the alternative, when I looked at the quote-unquote Christian culture, this is during that whole WWJD phase, when I looked at what the alternative was, I was very disappointed. Now, let me just take a side. I say, there are Christian movies out there, Christian music, those things. I bless the people that are trying, but at the same time, let's be honest, a lot of it's not very good. People are like, oh yeah, this movie's great. What was it? Facing the Giants, or whatever. There's like this church that makes movies, and you can kind of tell it's a church that makes movies because it's not like professional actors. It kind of looks like a very well done church skit. And so I watched these and I'm like, it's great that they're trying. But I was like it just doesn't feel like it's that good, right? If I were to show it to someone else, I'd be like, what are you watching? Don't they have any money for effects? What is that? And so for me, like the struggle I've had is when I look at quote unquote Christian culture, a lot of it is inferior, essentially. Artistically, all these different things, it doesn't measure up. And I actually grew up, again, I'm dating myself, I was a Smashing Pumpkins fan, rock music back in the day. I love Smashing Pumpkins. Billy Corgan, the lead singer, he's always been known to be a spiritual guy, and he actually very recently was quoted, this is maybe within 2 or 3 weeks ago, and they asked him, all right, Billy Corgan, what's the future of rock and roll? And him being the spiritual man that he is, he said, the future of rock and roll is God. God is uncharted territory for rock and roll. And everyone was kind of surprised with this statement. And so they're like, okay, so what would you, Billy Corgan, say to these Christian rock bands? He says, make better music. If you really want to glorify God, he's like Jesus would want to listen to good music. That's what he said. But regardless, there's this, how we engage with culture. There's a tension there. I talked about how as a Korean American, there was a lot of confusion over who I was. Was I more Korean? Was I more American? There was a tension there. I was constantly being pulled in different directions. And in the same way, we as believers, as Christians, there's a tension there. Pop culture is very influential, especially here in Korea. Pop culture has had a huge influence on America, but I think Korea always likes to go a little step further. And pop culture here in Korea, we got a lot of children in the room, I think has a serious impact on them. I've seen it. I remember when I used to teach, I was teaching at an international school in Russia. My parents are missionaries out in Russia, and I was serving over there. And these little kids, they weren't excited about school, but they were always excited about saying these random English phrases that they learned from K-pop. Even if it made no sense. But they were excited for the moment, and the moment they said it, they would all smile and give each other high fives. I was like, what's going on? That's not even good English. I think they were like, oh, maybe one more time, stuff like that. that brought them joy because of the influence that it had on them. And so really, what I want to bring up here is that pop culture has a very large impact on us. And I'm not telling you, like people were saying about 10, 20 years ago, to separate yourself from that. But I'm telling you that you have to stand in tension. On one hand, people just kind of consume culture without really thinking about it, without really recognizing the influence that it has on them. I'm saying not to do that. Be mindful. I know we have a lot of K-pop fans here that aren't even Korean. But be mindful of really what it does to you, right? But at the same time, the other extreme is to completely separate yourself and to just not partake of it at all. And I think that's wrong in itself as well. What Paul is telling us is look at the good things in culture, take it and redeem it. And use these things to make yourself a better witness. Paul did that himself. Right? Paul did that himself. He took culture and he used it for the gospel. Paul only cared about the gospel, and he would use culture for the sake of the gospel. And so, again, I can't give you a simple do this, do that. No, you got to stand in tension. Be mindful of what influences, but also be mindful that you need to be able to be a witness to this world. Next slide, please. I talked a little bit about Paul's example. I could even go back a little bit further. If you look at Christ, when you look at the parables, you could easily argue that the parables was Jesus using Jewish culture to speak his words, to teach people through Jewish culture, right? You go into like the first century church, a lot of people were using Greek philosophy, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. They were using Greek philosophy to explain more about the Bible. That's where a lot of theology came from, was using Aristotelian thought and these different things to get a better understanding of God through these systems. So they were using philosophical systems that had nothing to do with God, and were using them to explain God. You look at all these different things, like even church hymns. I find this church a little funny because they love hymns. But even church hymns were basically bar songs. So these weren't necessarily religious songs. These were the common songs of the era. And God used those. If you look at the revivals, it was like when Wesley was going around, it's his brother who was writing these songs that were using these catchy tunes of that era to speak into the hearts of many. D.L. Moody had Sankey, who was also doing the same thing. He was using music, using culture to speak into their lives. And in many ways, people would say it wasn't really Moody who did the event, who brought the revival. It was the music of Sankey that did these things. God has used art. God has used culture in the past. Even here in Korea, the interesting thing about Korea is the concept of Hananim is something that predates Christianity and made it easier for the church or for the gospel to be understood here, because Koreans already had an understanding of a one true God. You look at Korea, people always know Korea as the morning prayer, the morning prayer movement. Morning prayer honestly predates Christianity. This was always a praying culture. Kind of praying to the wrong person, but it was always a praying culture, and God has used that to not only create a separate identity for the Korean church, but it's how Koreans are actually meeting God is through the morning prayer movement that in many ways is cultural. You look at holidays. I've always, for whatever reason, I've always liked speaking on holidays because I like to take a holiday and kind of demythalize it, where you take it and you actually break it down and understand the original meaning behind it. When you do that, you kind of realize that most holidays have pagan backgrounds. I think the one that I found that didn't was like Good Friday. Everything else, Christmas, Easter, they come from these kind of weird holidays from the past, right? And you have relics from that. You have the Easter Bunny, what is that? You have like a Christmas tree, you have Santa Claus, all these different elements from its original root, right? Even so, the church has used that and taken these holidays and Christianized them in a way that it actually does something quote unquote positive. God has used culture in the past. God has used the arts in the past. You think about some of the greatest works of art, of music, all these different things, and they came initially to glorify God. Michelangelo, Da Vinci, all these different things. A lot of them were initially to glorify God. So what I really want to encourage you guys today is when you look at this passage, when it says whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, we need to engage with culture. I'm very tempted to do this, engage, but I'm going to stop. We need to engage with culture. Next slide, please. And while we do that, there's two things we need to remember. We need to remember who we are. We are citizens of heaven. That's our true identity. But we have to remember where we are. We're in a particular culture right now. For us in this room, we're in Korea right now. We have to remember that. And we have to be able to interact within this culture. Now, as an aside, honestly, my hope is to see more of a Christian influence come into Korean culture. I would love to see K-pop become more Christian, honestly. It needs Jesus. I would love to see more of a message of hope and joy spread through it rather than kind of what's being spread right now. And there may be some of you in this room that might have that gifting. Whether it's music, whether it's like film, art, whatever it might be. There may be some of you in this room right now that have that creative gifting, that creative calling. And I want to encourage you that if God has gifted you in that particular way, if God has made you for that, then create things that glorify Him. Use those gifts. I know the entertainment industry is one of the darkest places in the world. And my hope is that, for those of you that have those callings, that you have people that can encourage you, that can lift you up, that can really safeguard you versus the pressures that you'll face. It's kind of funny. I actually have a few entertainment industry friends. Tim's a friend of mine. He used to be popular. He's not popular anymore. But the interesting thing about him was that, him being a pastor's kid, he was very particular about putting Christian songs on his albums. And they're often songs that he wrote with his brothers, one of whom is a pastor. And there was a song, I think it's called like Morning Star or something like that. And that particular song, what really kind of blew me away was one of my really close friends from seminary, who's now a pastor herself, she really liked him. And she was a big idol, she was a big fan of Tim back in the day. And what happened was she listened to that particular song a lot, not knowing what the words meant. And later on, she got saved, and she actually went to the church that he was serving at. And in many ways, it was kind of the fact that she knew that he was at that church, and the fact that that song spoke to her, that kind of led her down that path. And so I always joke with her, I'm like, you're saved by Tim's song. And she always gets mad at me. She's like, shut up. And I was like, hey, he's over there. You should let him know that he made a pastor from that song. But she's kind of embarrassed, so she never does that. But regardless, I've heard stories about how God has been able to use things like this. And so for those of you in the room that might have that gifting, that might have that calling, I want to encourage you, I want to bless you, and I want you to have the covering that you need. Now for everyone else, we're in a culture. We need to remember that first and foremost, we are believers, that we are citizens of heaven. But we also have to remember we have to stand in tension in knowing how to engage that culture and knowing how to be effective witnesses by taking the common grace, the good things that we see in culture, and using them for the kingdom and for the glory. That's going to look different for all of us. What I'm telling you is, don't separate yourself and don't just consume mindlessly. Stand in tension. It's a little awkward, it's a little uncomfortable, but God will use it. So with that, let's pray. Father, we thank you, we praise you. And we pray, Lord, that you would give us wisdom and discernment into how you desire us to engage with culture. That we would be able to see, Lord, your traces, your goodness in these things, and that we would be able to use these things and redeem them in such a way that they would teach us more about you, that they would encourage us in a way that we would understand more about you, and that would give us more opportunities to share about you through culture. Father, if there is anyone in this room that you are calling toward that, this role of being a culture creator, I pray, Lord, that you would continue to build up their giftings, that you would continue to build up their skills, that you would surround them with people that would just war with them in prayer, that would fight for their purity, for their sanctity. And I just pray, Lord, that they would be encouraged and blessed, Lord. May you raise up many things, Lord, that reflect your goodness, your greatness. May you, once again, Lord, use culture for the sake of growing your kingdom. Father, we thank you, Lord. We praise you. We pray, Lord, that we would be encouraged by this. And that we would stand in tension for you. We thank you and praise you in the name of Jesus. Amen.